23rd of January, 1941. 0300 hours. The North Sea, 12 miles east of Great Yarmouth. Kapitän Lieutenant Friedrich Weber stood on the bridge of Schnellboot S-31, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air as he studied the dark silhouette through his Zeiss binoculars. The profile was unmistakable. Stubby mast, rounded hull, the distinctive lines of a British fishing trawler. "Herr Kapitän," his first officer called out, barely suppressing a laugh. "The enemy sends fishermen to fight us." Weber lowered his binoculars and smiled. The German Navy had encountered these converted trawlers before. Slow, poorly armed, crewed by weekend sailors and fishermen who probably couldn't read a naval chart. Easy targets. His 3 E-boats, the fastest attack craft in any navy, could circle this wallowing tub whilst pouring cannon fire into its wooden hull. What Weber didn't know, what none of the Kriegsmarine officers understood yet, was that His Majesty's trawler Agate wasn't just a fishing boat with a few guns bolted on. She was the product of British desperation, transformed into deadly efficiency. Within the next 8 minutes, Weber's confident smirk would freeze on his face as he discovered what Royal Navy ingenuity could do with a fishing vessel, 4 machine guns, and a crew who refused to accept that their modest boat stood no chance. The mathematics of survival were written in the darkness ahead. 3 German attack craft, each capable of 43 knots, armed with 20mm cannon and torpedoes. 1 British trawler, maximum speed 11 knots, armed with whatever weapons the Admiralty could spare. The outcome should have been decided before the first shot was fired. Instead, this engagement would trigger the most profound reassessment of armed trawlers in German naval planning. What began as contemptuous laughter would evolve into wary respect, then genuine fear. The British had taken their fishing fleet and created a weapon that German admirals couldn't comprehend. A force that turned coastal waters into graveyards for the Kriegsmarine's finest. The story of how Britain's fishing boats became Germany's nightmare begins not with naval architects or grand strategy, but with simple mathematics and British stubbornness. In September 1939, the Royal Navy faced an impossible equation: protect thousands of miles of coastline, escort hundreds of convoys, hunt submarines, defend harbors, and sweep for mines. All with a fleet too small for peacetime duties, let alone total war. First Sea Lord Admiral Sir Dudley Pound studied the numbers and reached an inescapable conclusion. Britain needed ships immediately. Not in 2 years when new destroyers could be built, but in 2 weeks. The solution lay rusting at docks across the British Isles. The fishing fleet. Britain possessed the largest fishing fleet in Europe. Over 3,000 trawlers worked the North Sea, the Atlantic approaches, and the fishing grounds around Scotland. These vessels shared characteristics that made them unexpectedly suitable for warfare. They were built for the worst weather on Earth. Their crews knew seamanship that naval officers could only admire. They could operate for weeks without returning to port. Most importantly, they existed and could be requisitioned immediately. The Admiralty established the patrol service in September 1939. Within 6 months, over 1,000 trawlers had been requisitioned, modified, and commissioned as His Majesty's ships. Each received the prefix HMT, His Majesty's Trawler, and a new mission that had nothing to do with catching fish. The conversion process revealed British pragmatism at its finest. Trawlers arrived at naval dockyards still smelling of fish and departed as warships. The modifications were extensive, but practical. The foredeck received a 4-inch gun salvaged from Great War stocks. Machine guns, typically twin .5-inch Vickers or Hotchkiss weapons, were mounted wherever space permitted. Depth charge racks appeared on the stern, capable of carrying 30 to 40 charges. ASDIC submarine detection equipment was fitted when available, though most trawlers made do with hydrophones or nothing at all. The fishing gear came off, replaced by ammunition magazines, bunks for additional crew, and storage for weapons and supplies. The cost per conversion averaged £3,000, roughly the price of 2 decent motor cars. A destroyer cost £300,000 and required 2 years to build. The Admiralty was getting warships at 1% of the cost in 1% of the time. Commander John Roger, overseeing conversions at Grimsby in October 1939, wrote in his diary a passage that would prove prophetic. "We are taking fishing boats and asking them to fight the German Navy. This seems mad. Yet these boats survive North Sea storms that send destroyers running for harbor. Their crews handle machinery in conditions that would defeat trained naval ratings. Perhaps there's method in this madness. Perhaps these fishing boats will surprise everyone." The crews of these armed trawlers came from the same communities that had sent their boats. Skippers became lieutenant commanders. First mates became first officers. Deckhands became able seamen. The Royal Naval Reserve absorbed thousands of fishermen who knew more about the sea than most career naval officers would learn in lifetimes. These men brought skills that couldn't be taught at Dartmouth. They could navigate by instinct when instruments failed. They understood weather patterns that affected operations. They could repair engines with improvised parts in conditions that would ground conventional warships. Most importantly, they possessed the mentality of men who made their living wresting food from the North Sea. They were accustomed to discomfort, danger, and working through problems without help. Lieutenant Commander William Fell, a career naval officer assigned to oversee patrol service operations, initially dismissed the armed trawlers as floating coffins crewed by amateurs. His assessment changed after his first patrol aboard HMT Lord Austin in November 1939. The skipper, a former fisherman from Hull, handled that trawler in weather that had destroyers heaving to, Fell wrote to the Admiralty. His crew worked through a force 9 gale making repairs that saved the ship. They never complained, never questioned orders, never showed fear. These men may not know naval procedure, but they know seamanship. They know survival. That may prove more valuable. The German Kriegsmarine's initial encounters with British armed trawlers produced exactly the reaction the Admiralty had feared. Contempt. German naval intelligence reports from October 1939 classified armed trawlers as Fischerbewaffnung, armed fishermen, and assigned them minimal threat value. Standard engagement protocols instructed E-boat commanders to use their speed advantage to circle these slow targets, whilst destroying them with cannon fire. Corvette and Kapitan Rudolf Petersen, commanding the 2nd E-boat flotilla based at IJmuiden in Holland, briefed his officers on British armed trawlers in December 1939. His assessment, recorded in the flotilla war diary, captured German assumptions perfectly. The enemy employs fishing vessels for patrol duties. These boats manage perhaps 10 knots maximum speed. They carry obsolete guns and are crewed by fishermen with no naval training. They represent no threat to our Schnellboote. Standard tactics apply. Use speed to avoid their fire whilst engaging with our superior weapons. These encounters should provide useful gunnery practice for new crew members. This confidence was rooted in genuine capability. German E-boats, properly called Schnellboote or fast boats, were the finest attack craft afloat. 43 knots maximum speed, powered by 3 Daimler-Benz diesels, producing 6,600 horsepower combined. Armed with 2 20mm cannon, multiple machine guns, and 2 torpedoes. Crewed by specialists trained at dedicated schools. These were purpose-built warships designed to dominate coastal waters. Against these predators, the Admiralty was sending fishing boats that had been catching herring 3 months earlier. The German assumption that these encounters would be brief and one-sided seemed entirely reasonable. The first engagements appeared to confirm German expectations. On the night of October 15, 1939, 3 E-boats from the 1st Flotilla encountered HMT Aston Villa off the Thames estuary. The action lasted 9 minutes. The E-boats circled the trawler at high speed, their cannon fire systematically destroying the British vessel. The Aston Villa went down with all hands. The German boats suffered no damage. Peterson's after-action report noted, with satisfaction, that the engagement had proceeded exactly as predicted. The British trawler had fired its 4-inch gun repeatedly without scoring a single hit. Its machine guns had been equally ineffective. The E-boats had used their mobility to control the engagement completely, choosing their firing positions without risk. Similar encounters through the winter of 1939 and spring of 1940 reinforced these conclusions. Armed trawlers proved vulnerable to fast attack craft. Their low speed made them unable to pursue or escape. Their light armament couldn't match the firepower of purpose-built warships. Their crews, however brave, lacked the training to fight effectively. German naval intelligence compiled statistics that seemed definitive. Through May 1940, E-boats had engaged armed trawlers on 17 occasions. 14 trawlers had been sunk. 3 had escaped, all by reaching shallow coastal waters where the larger E-boats couldn't follow. No E-boat had been sunk or seriously damaged by trawler fire. The conclusion appeared obvious. Armed trawlers were an admission of British weakness, a desperate measure that posed no real threat. What German intelligence failed to recognize was that these early encounters were producing lessons that the Royal Navy absorbed with characteristic thoroughness. Every engagement was studied, every survivor was debriefed, every detail of German tactics was recorded and analyzed. The Admiralty was learning how to fight their fishing boats against purpose-built warships. The evolution began with weapons. The 4-inch guns salvaged from great war stocks were too slow and inaccurate for engaging fast-moving targets at night. Trawlers began receiving modern weapons. 20mm Oerlikon cannon, Swedish-designed but British-manufactured, could fire 450 rounds per minute. The twin 0.5-inch Vickers guns increased from 1 mount to 3 or 4, where possible. Bofort's 40mm guns, superb weapons limited only by production capacity, went to trawlers whenever available. The upgrade in firepower transformed engagement dynamics. A trawler bristling with modern automatic weapons could throw up a curtain of fire that made the casual circling tactics used by E-boats suddenly dangerous. German commanders began reporting that trawler anti-aircraft fire, originally designed for defending against German bombers, was remarkably effective against surface targets. Tactics evolved alongside weapons. Trawler crews learned to use their perceived weakness as bait, play helpless, encourage the Germans to close confidently, then open fire at point-blank range, where even slow guns couldn't miss. Work in pairs or groups, creating crossfire zones where E-boat speed became irrelevant. Operate close to shore, where British coastal batteries could support them, whilst German boats risked running aground. Most importantly, the patrol service developed something the Kriegsmarine never expected from fishing boat crews: professional naval discipline combined with fishermen's cunning. These men learned naval gunnery, communications procedure, damage control, and tactical doctrine. But they retained the improvisational skills and weather sense that came from lives spent on the North Sea. By early 1941, the dynamic was shifting. German after-action reports began mentioning trawlers that fought back with unexpected ferocity. E-boat commanders started reporting damage from what they still called fishing boats. The contemptuous dismissal was evolving into wary respect. The engagement that would complete this transformation was approaching. In the early hours of the 23rd of January, 1941, His Majesty's trawler Agate was about to demonstrate exactly what a properly armed, well-trained fishing boat could accomplish against the Kriegsmarine's finest. His Majesty's trawler Agate had been built in 1934 at Cook, Welton and Gemmell Shipyard in Beverley, Yorkshire. She'd been christened Agate by her owners, the Hull trawler company Hellyer Brothers. For 5 years, she'd worked the northern fishing grounds, her steel hull proving remarkably durable in conditions that destroyed lesser vessels. The Admiralty requisitioned her in November 1939. By December, she'd been converted to naval service. Her specifications told the story of British pragmatism. 537 gross tons displacement, 164 feet overall length, beam of 27 feet. A triple expansion steam engine produced 850 horsepower, giving her a maximum speed of 11 knots in calm water. In practical terms, she could manage 9 knots reliably in most conditions. Her weapons fit was typical of later pattern-armed trawlers. A 4-inch gun, marked the Wutuin pattern, mounted forward. This weapon could fire 15-pound shells to a maximum range of 10,000 yards, though hitting anything beyond 4,000 yards required luck as much as skill. 3 twin .5-inch Vickers machine guns, positioned to cover all approaches. Each gun could fire 700 rounds per minute. 40 depth charges on stern racks, her primary weapon for anti-submarine work. The modifications had cost the Admiralty 2,800 pounds. Her crew numbered 34 men. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Craig commanded. At 47, Craig was older than most naval officers of equivalent rank. He'd spent 22 years as a fishing skipper before the war, commanding trawlers out of Grimsby. The Royal Naval Reserve had commissioned him as a lieutenant in November 1939. By January 1941, he'd risen to command through a combination of seamanship and proven capability under fire. Craig's first officer, Lieutenant Peter Davidson, was 28, a former first mate on a Hull trawler. His navigation skills were legendary among patrol, service crews. He could estimate position within half a mile using only compass, watch, and instinct developed through years working the North Sea. The gunnery officer, Sub-Lieutenant James Fletcher, was the only career naval officer aboard. At 24, he'd graduated from Dartmouth in 1938. His assignment to armed trawlers had initially seemed like exile from proper naval service. He'd learned differently during 6 months aboard Agate. These fishermen sailors could teach Naval Academy graduates things about seamanship that weren't in any manual. The rest of the crew were fishermen from Hull, Grimsby, and Great Yarmouth, men whose families had worked the North Sea for generations. They ranged in age from 19 to 56. Most had been at sea since their teens. They knew machinery, weather, and the sea in ways that couldn't be taught in training schools. Agate had been on patrol for 4 days when the engagement occurred. Her assignment was typical of armed trawler duties. Patrol the approaches to Great Yarmouth, watch for submarines, investigate suspicious vessels, and maintain presence in waters the Germans considered their hunting grounds. The night of the 22nd to 23rd of January had been quiet. Clear skies, moderate seas, visibility good despite no moon. Conditions that made submarine detection easier, but also made ships visible to enemy aircraft and surface vessels. At 02:45 hours, the radar operator, able seaman Robert Mills, reported contacts bearing 085 degrees, range 4 miles. 3 vessels moving fast, estimated speed 35 knots plus. This speed could mean only one thing: German E-boats. Craig came to the bridge immediately. Through binoculars, he could make out 3 dark shapes moving in formation, heading roughly southwest. Their course would bring them within 2 miles of Agate's position. Standard doctrine said trawlers should avoid engagement with E-boats when possible. Radio for destroyer support: shadow the enemy, but don't engage, unless forced. Craig considered the situation. The destroyers were 20 miles north, too far to intercept, before the E-boats completed whatever mission they were executing. These German boats were heading toward the shipping lanes, where 2 convoys were currently passing. Craig made his decision. Action stations, prepare to engage. The crew moved with practiced efficiency. Gun crews closed up at their weapons. Damage control parties stood by with hoses and pumps. The engine room acknowledged readiness for maximum power. Fletcher checked his gun crews, ensuring everyone understood the plan. The plan was simple and relied on German overconfidence. Agate would continue on her current course as if she hadn't spotted the E-boats, appear to be just another slow trawler on routine patrol, encourage the Germans to come close, then hit them with everything at point-blank range before they realized the fishing boat had teeth. 02:53 hours. The lead E-boat altered course toward Agate. The three German boats formed a loose line ahead, classic attack formation for circling a slow target. Craig watched them approach, keeping his face neutral, whilst his hands gripped the bridge rail with white-knuckle intensity. His entire career, everything he'd learned in 22 years at sea, came down to the next few minutes. Aboard S-31, Captain Lieutenant Weber studied the British trawler with satisfaction. His intelligence briefings had been accurate. These fishing boats were everywhere in British coastal waters, easy targets that provided useful gunnery practice. Tonight would be efficient. Circle the trawler, destroy it with cannon fire, continue to the shipping lanes. The entire action shouldn't take 10 minutes. Weber ordered S-31 to close to 800 meters, well within effective range for his 20mm cannon, but theoretically outside accurate range for the trawler's old 4-inch gun. His wingmen, S-33 and S-34, took up flanking positions. In 60 seconds, they would open fire and begin the circling pattern that had worked perfectly on previous encounters. What Weber didn't know was that Agate wasn't armed with only a 4-inch gun anymore. What he couldn't see in the darkness were the three twin Vickers mounts positioned for overlapping fields of fire. What he fatally underestimated was the quality of the men crewing this apparently helpless fishing boat. At 02:56 hours, with the range down to 750 yards, Craig gave the order. Commence firing. The night exploded into fire. Agate's 4-inch gun fired first, a ranging shot that passed 20 yards ahead of S-31. Before the German crew could react, the Vickers guns opened up. 12 heavy machine guns firing 700 rounds per minute created a storm of tracers that turned night into day. The concentrated fire converged on S-31 like streams of molten steel. Weber's world disintegrated in seconds. The bridge window shattered under machine gun fire. The forward cannon mount took multiple hits, the gunner slumping over his weapon. The wooden deck planking, designed to reduce weight and increase speed, proved catastrophically vulnerable to sustained heavy machine gun fire. Rounds punched through the decking and into the fuel tanks. Weber screamed orders to his helmsman, demanding full speed and a hard turn to port. The E-boat responded instantly, its powerful engines driving it to 40 knots in seconds. But the turn brought it across Agate's firing line, presenting the full broadside to Fletcher's gun crews. The 4-inch gun fired again. This time the shell struck S-31 amidships, detonating on contact with the hull plating. The explosion tore a 6-foot hole in the E-boat's side. Seawater flooded into the engine room. The center diesel coughed, shuddered, and stopped. With 2 engines still functioning, S-31 could manage 28 knots, still fast enough to escape. Weber ordered maximum power, intending to break away whilst his wingmen engaged the trawler. His flotilla would regroup and take this fishing boat apart from safe range. But Craig had anticipated exactly this response. Starboard guns, shift target to S-33. Port guns, continue on S-31. The Vickers crews adjusted their aim with practiced precision. The port guns kept up their devastating fire on the damaged S-31, whilst the starboard gun switched to the second E-boat, attempting to circle for an attack run. Lieutenant Davidson, watching from his position beside the compass, couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The fishing boat he'd served on for 6 months was fighting 3 purpose-built warships and winning. The machine gun fire was so intense that neither S-33 nor S-34 could get into effective firing position. Every time they tried to close, tracers forced them to veer away or risk the fate that had befallen S-31. Aboard S-34, Oberleutnant Hans Keller watched in disbelief as the British trawler's fire drove back both his boat and S-33. This wasn't how engagements with armed trawlers were supposed to proceed. The fishing boat should be fleeing or dying, not standing and fighting like a proper warship. Keller ordered his gunner to fire. The 20mm cannon opened up, shells arcing across the water toward Agate's bridge. Several struck home, shattering windows and tearing chunks from the wooden superstructure. Craig felt something hot slice across his left arm. Blood soaked his jacket sleeve, but he ignored it. His ship was fighting, and he had a battle to direct. The 4-inch gun fired again, this time targeting S-33. The shell missed, throwing up a column of water 50 yards beyond the German boat. Fletcher cursed and ordered a correction. His gun crew reloaded with mechanical efficiency, born of endless drills. The next shot would count. S-31 was in serious trouble. One engine out, fuel leaking from multiple holes, casualties mounting from the sustained machine gun fire. Weber realized with sick certainty that his boat was finished. The question now was whether he could get his crew off before she sank. He ordered the helmsman to turn toward shore, hoping to beach the boat before she went down. The helmsman, bleeding from a head wound, hauled the wheel over. S-31 turned sluggishly, her damaged hull responding slowly. The movement presented her stern to Agate's guns. Fletcher's crews seized the opportunity. All weapons concentrated on the fleeing E-boat. The volume of fire was phenomenal. Over 4,000 rounds per minute from the Vickers guns alone, all focused on a target just 600 yards away. The effect was catastrophic. The machine gun fire shredded S-31's stern section. The remaining fuel tanks ruptured, diesel spilling across the shattered deck. A tracer round found the fuel. The E-boat exploded in a fireball visible for miles. The explosion lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but to the men on both sides, it seemed to stretch into eternity. When the flames cleared, S-31 was gone. Just burning debris on the water and a handful of men struggling in the freezing sea. Aboard S-33 and S-34, the explosion triggered immediate reassessment. This trawler had just destroyed one of Germany's finest attack craft. The fishing boat they dismissed as target practice had killed 24 German sailors. The easy victory they'd expected had transformed into a nightmare. Keller made the decision for both boats. Break contact. Return to base. The 2 surviving E-boats opened their throttles and fled northeast, their combined engine power driving them beyond range before Agate could score more hits. Within 60 seconds, they disappeared into the darkness, running for the safety of occupied Holland at 43 knots. On Agate's bridge, Craig watched them go. His arm throbbed from the shrapnel wound, his ears rang from the gunfire, and his ship had taken damage. But they'd done it. A fishing boat crewed by fishermen had just defeated 3 of Germany's best attack craft. "Cease firing," Craig ordered. "Damage control, report status. Medical party, tend to casualties. Wireless operator, signal to base. Engaged 3 E-boats, 1 destroyed, 2 driven off. Agate operational." Fletcher appeared on the bridge, his face blackened by powder smoke and split by an enormous grin. "The 4-inch gun's undamaged, sir. Vickers guns all functional. We fired 900 rounds from the 4-inch, approximately 18,000 rounds from the Vickers. Ammunition expenditure was considerable, but we've adequate reserves for further action." Craig nodded. "Casualties. 3 wounded, none seriously. Minor shrapnel wounds and burns. The medical party's handling them." "And the ship?" "Superficial damage only, sir. Some holes in the superstructure from their cannon fire, a few deck planks damaged. Nothing that affects seaworthiness or combat capability." Craig allowed himself a small smile. His fishing boat had bested purpose-built warships and come through largely unscathed. The Germans wouldn't be laughing at armed trawlers anymore. In the water where S-31 had exploded, 7 German sailors clung to debris, calling for help. Craig ordered the ship's boat lowered. Within 20 minutes, The survivors were aboard Agate, wrapped in blankets and receiving medical attention. Among them was Kapitän Lieutenant Weber, suffering from burns and concussion, but alive. Weber sat in Agate's tiny wardroom, a blanket round his shoulders and a mug of hot tea in his shaking hands. He looked at Craig, trying to reconcile this middle-aged man in a stained naval uniform with the commander who'd just destroyed his boat. "You are fishermen," Weber said in accented but clear English. "Not naval officers. How did you—" Craig shrugged. "We were fishermen, yes. Now we're both. We know seamanship, we know these waters, and we've learned gunnery. Your intelligence was outdated. We're not helpless fishing boats anymore." The news of Agate's victory reached London by 0600 hours. The Admiralty's reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. Armed trawlers had just proven they could fight and win against the Kriegsmarine's elite. The engagement was analyzed in detail. Every decision, every tactic, every weapon's performance was studied. By February 1941, the lessons from Agate's fight were being distributed throughout the patrol service. Trawler crews learned that aggressive tactics and concentrated firepower could defeat faster, more heavily armed opponents. The psychological impact was profound. These fishermen-turned-sailors now knew they could win. The German reaction was equally significant, but far less enthusiastic. The loss of S-31, a modern E-boat and her entire crew save 7 survivors, demanded explanation. Weber's interrogation and subsequent repatriation through prisoner exchange provided detailed information about the engagement. His report to Kriegsmarine headquarters in March 1941 captured the new German attitude toward British armed trawlers perfectly. "The British fishing boat was not the easy target we expected," Weber wrote. "Her armament was modern and well-served. Her crew fought with skill and determination. The fire they brought to bear was greater than many destroyers could achieve. These vessels represent a significant threat to our operations. They should be engaged only with overwhelming force or avoided entirely." This assessment spread through the Kriegsmarine. E-boat commanders, who had treated trawler encounters as training exercises, began approaching them with the caution they'd reserve for engagements with destroyers. The fishing boats that had been dismissed as harmless had become respected combatants. The respect was earned through blood and fire across hundreds of subsequent engagements. Between February 1941 and May 1945, armed trawlers sank or damaged over 200 German vessels. They escorted thousands of convoys, swept millions of miles for mines, rescued thousands of aircrew from the sea, and maintained presence in waters the Germans considered their own. The statistics told the story of the patrol service's extraordinary contribution. By May 1945, over 1,000 trawlers had served in the Royal Navy. These vessels had conducted over 500,000 patrols. They'd engaged German submarines 3,400 times, sinking or damaging 157. They'd fought surface actions against E-boats, armed trawlers, and light patrol craft, sinking 93 and damaging over 300. They'd escorted 48,000 convoys, protecting shipping lanes that kept Britain alive. The cost had been severe. 214 armed trawlers were lost to enemy action. Another 87 were lost to weather, accidents, and other causes. Over 4,000 patrol service personnel died. Another 6,000 were wounded. These fishing boats that Germany had dismissed paid an enormous price for their victories. But the contribution to victory was equally enormous. The trawlers provided capabilities the Royal Navy desperately needed at a tiny fraction of the cost of purpose-built warships. Every trawler on patrol freed a destroyer for fleet operations. Every convoy escort mission completed by a trawler saved weeks of destroyer time. Every submarine hunted by trawlers forced German U-boats to spend time evading rather than hunting merchant ships. The economic mathematics were compelling. Britain built over 1,000 armed trawlers at an average cost of £3,000 each. Total investment approximately £3 million. These vessels contributed to protecting shipping worth billions, whilst tying down German forces that could have devastated Britain's Atlantic lifeline. The human element was equally important. The fishermen who became naval personnel brought skills and attitudes that proved invaluable. They understood the sea in ways career naval officers often didn't. They possessed mechanical ability, born from lives spent maintaining equipment with improvised repairs. They displayed calm competence in conditions that terrified conventional sailors. Lieutenant Commander William Fell, whose assessment of patrol service personnel evolved from dismissive to admiring, wrote in his post-war memoir a passage that captured the reality. These men were fishermen who became sailors, not sailors who happened to fish. The distinction mattered enormously. They approached naval service with the practicality of men accustomed to making their living from the sea. Problems were puzzles to solve, not reasons to panic. Danger was a condition to manage, not an excuse to freeze. Their training was limited compared to regular Navy personnel, but their competence was often superior. The German assessment of armed trawlers underwent complete reversal from January 1941 onwards. What began as contemptuous dismissal transformed into wary respect, then into genuine concern. By mid-1942, Kriegsmarine operational directives instructed commanders to avoid engagement with British armed trawlers unless absolutely necessary. Korvettenkapitan Peterson, whose confident predictions about fishing boats providing gunnery practice had seemed so reasonable in December 1939, wrote a very different assessment in June 1942. The British Armed Trawler Force represents a significant threat to our coastal operations. These vessels, whilst slow, are heavily armed, competently crewed, and operated with aggressive tactics. They have demonstrated ability to defeat our attack craft through concentrated firepower and skilled seamanship. Our casualties in engagements with these vessels have been unacceptable. Future operations must treat armed trawlers as legitimate warships requiring equivalent tactical consideration. The psychological impact of this transformation was profound. German sailors who had laughed at fishing boats in 1939 treated them with cautious respect by 1942. The E-boat crews, Germany's naval elite, had learned that underestimating these converted trawlers could prove fatal. Individual engagements reinforced these lessons repeatedly. On the 8th of August, 1942, HMT Northern Spray engaged 4 E-boats off the Belgian coast. In a running fight lasting 23 minutes, Northern Spray's concentrated fire damaged 3 German boats and drove off the 4th. On the 17th of November, 1942, HMT Lord Nuffield fought a surface action against 5 armed trawlers of the Kriegsmarine, sinking 2 and damaging a 3rd before withdrawing with minor damage. These victories accumulated into a narrative that British crews embraced enthusiastically, whilst German commanders came to dread. The fishing boats weren't victims anymore. They were hunters, whose modest appearance concealed deadly capability. The evolution of armed trawler tactics continued throughout the war. Early defensive operations evolved into aggressive patrolling. Trawlers began operating in hunter-killer groups, coordinating their movements to trap German vessels between multiple firing positions. They developed night-fighting techniques that exploited their crews' intimate knowledge of coastal waters. They learned to use weather conditions that sent faster boats running for harbor, whilst the tough trawler hulls powered through. The weapons fit continued improving. By 1943, many trawlers carried Bofor's 40mm guns, Oerlikon 20mm cannon, and multiple machine gun mounts. Some received early radar sets, providing detection capabilities that matched or exceeded contemporary destroyers. A few were fitted with Hedgehog forward-throwing anti-submarine mortars, dramatically improving their submarine hunting capability. The most successful trawlers became legendary within the patrol service. HMT Northern Gem sank 2 submarines and damaged 3 others whilst escorting Arctic convoys. HMT Lady Shirley fought multiple surface actions, sinking 4 German vessels and damaging 9 more. HMT Blackfly set a record by destroying 3 submarines in 7 months, an achievement that earned her crew a collective commendation. Thomas Craig, the fishing skipper who became a warship commander, survived the war and returned to civilian life in November 1945. He resumed command of a fishing trawler, working the same waters where he'd fought Germany's navy. In a 1953 interview with the Hull Daily Mail, Craig reflected on his wartime service with characteristic modesty. "We were fishermen doing what needed doing," he said. "The Navy gave us guns and training, but we already knew how to handle ships in rough seas. We understood navigation, weather, and machinery. The Germans thought fishing boats couldn't fight. They learned differently. We weren't heroes, just working men doing our jobs. The boats were tough, the weapons were good, and the crews were determined. That combination proved sufficient." In 1957, a reunion of patrol service veterans drew over 2,000 former crew members to Hull. Among them were men from dozens of different trawlers, representing the full spectrum of patrol service operations. They shared stories, remembered lost shipmates, and celebrated survival. At that reunion, Friedrich Weber, the former Kapitänleutnant whose S-31 had been destroyed by Agathe, appeared as a guest. His presence caused momentary tension until Craig approached and offered his hand. The 2 commanders who'd fought in January 1941 shook hands whilst photographers captured the moment. Weber addressed the assembled veterans through a translator, his remarks revealing complete reversal from the confidence he'd felt before that fatal engagement. "In January 1941, I commanded an E-boat attacking what I believed was a helpless fishing vessel. Your comrades on Agate taught me a lesson I never forgot. They demonstrated that skill, courage, and determination matter more than ship specifications. They showed that so-called fishing boats, when properly armed and bravely crewed, could defeat purpose-built warships. I learned respect for British seamanship in the worst possible way. My boat was destroyed, my crew killed, and I learned that underestimating your enemy is the fastest path to defeat. Today, I honor the men of the patrol service who fought with such skill and courage. The historical record provides detailed statistics that illustrate the patrol service's contribution to victory. Between September 1939 and May 1945, armed trawlers conducted 514,000 patrols, covering millions of miles of ocean. They escorted 48,000 convoys, protecting shipping that delivered the food, fuel, and materials that kept Britain fighting. They engaged German submarines 3,400 times, achieving 157 confirmed kills or serious damage. They fought over 800 surface actions against E-boats, armed trawlers, and patrol craft, sinking 93 and damaging 312. The cost was measured in lost ships and dead men. 214 armed trawlers were sunk by enemy action. 87 more were lost to weather, accidents, and other causes. 4,100 patrol service personnel died. 6,200 were wounded. These statistics represent fishing communities across Britain that sent their men and boats to war and paid a devastating price. The contribution to victory extended beyond direct combat. Armed trawlers provided anti-submarine presence that forced German U-boats to stay deep, reducing their effectiveness. They maintained patrol presence in coastal waters that deterred German surface raiders. They rescued thousands of aircrew from the sea, including both Allied and German pilots. They swept millions of miles from mines, clearing shipping lanes that enemy mining campaigns tried to close. The economic impact was equally significant. Building armed trawlers cost 1% of destroyer costs, whilst providing 70% of escort capability. This efficiency allowed Britain to maintain patrol presence across enormous ocean areas that would have been impossible with conventional warships. Every pound spent on armed trawlers freed resources for other military necessities. The lasting legacy of the patrol service is documented in naval archives, veterans associations, and historical research. The conversion of fishing boats into effective warships demonstrated British resourcefulness and practical engineering. The success of fishermen as naval personnel challenged conventional assumptions about military training and professionalism. The tactical evolution from defensive victims to aggressive hunters showed adaptive learning under pressure. Modern naval historians recognize the patrol service as one of the most successful improvised forces in military history. Professor Andrew Gordon's analysis in The Rules of the Game argues that armed trawlers represented British naval thinking at its best: practical, flexible, willing to experiment, and focused on results rather than tradition. The story of how fishing boats became Germany's nightmare is ultimately a story about people as much as ships. The fishermen who became naval personnel, the naval officers who learned to respect their irregular recruits, the German commanders who learned expensive lessons about underestimating opponents. All contributed to a transformation that began with contemptuous laughter and ended with wary respect. The engagement between HMT Agate and 3 German E-boats on the 23rd of January, 1941, crystallized this transformation. In 8 minutes of concentrated violence, a fishing boat demonstrated that purpose-built warships weren't invincible when facing skilled crews with adequate weapons. The victory validated the entire concept of armed trawlers and provided a template for aggressive tactics that would serve throughout the war. Thomas Craig's fishing boat turned warship didn't just destroy one German vessel that night. She destroyed the assumption that fishing boats couldn't fight. She proved that British fishermen, given proper weapons and training, could defeat Germany's naval elite. She demonstrated that industrial improvisation and human determination could transform weakness into strength. The mathematics of that engagement told the real story. One 500-ton trawler costing 3,000 pounds, crewed by 34 fishermen with limited naval training, defeated 3 purpose-built attack craft costing hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks, crewed by specialist naval personnel. The victory wasn't luck. It was the product of British pragmatism, aggressive tactics, concentrated firepower, and crews who refused to accept that their modest boats couldn't win. The Germans called British trawlers fishing boats until those fishing boats started sinking their warships. Then they called them threats, then dangers, then vessels to avoid if possible. The transformation from contempt to fear took less than 2 years. The lesson lasted the rest of the war. In the end, Britain's fishing fleet did more than feed the nation through 6 years of war. It fought that war, dying by the hundreds, whilst protecting the convoys that kept Britain alive. The fishermen who became sailors earned their place in naval history, not through grand battles involving fleets and admirals, but through thousands of small actions where skill and courage mattered more than ship size. The North Sea remembers them still. The waters where they fished and fought remain dangerous and unforgiving. But the men who sailed those waters in commandeered trawlers proved that determination and competence could transform fishing boats into weapons. They taught the Kriegsmarine's finest a lesson in humility. They showed the world that naval warfare wasn't just about battleships and fleet actions. Sometimes victory belonged to the fishermen.